Welcome to LaRouche Pack Saturday Evening Class Series. My name is Tony Pappard. Tonight is going to be Bob Ingram, Robert Ingram, What Benjamin Franklin Can Teach Us About Economics. What goes by the name of economics in the US and most of the world today is not economics at all, but one of a series of British created religious cults in the name of economics. And this is the brand of economics, or the brands of economics, which are being offered to candidate Trump by the Heritage Foundation and others. This fight against the complete falsehood of academic economics, and that's what we find throughout the political scene in the US, with few exceptions, was a central struggle of Lyndon LaRouche from early in his life until his death in 2019. So Robert Ingram will take us back to the birth of our republic with under the preeminent figure of Benjamin Franklin, for what economics actually is all about. So with that, let me pass it to Bob.
Okay, is my audio okay, Tony?
Sounds good.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, the title of this class is What Ben Franklin Can Teach Us About Economics. Beware, the redcoats are coming. And I'm going to reference that second phrase in just a moment. Look, I'm going to begin with just a very brief self-promotion, which is that what I'm going to present to you tonight is taken from a particular chapter of a new book that I just published called Benjamin Franklin's America, Volume 1, To Do Good. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But it was published yesterday, and it is up for sale on Amazon. So people can read a lot more about both what we're going to cover tonight and about Benjamin Franklin in that book. All right, so let's get started. Look, this is not a history lesson. You know, I'm not here tonight to give you a history lesson about Ben Franklin and the American Revolution and all of that. This class, as I'm sure everyone who is on this call is already aware, occurs in the midst of warfare, political warfare, to take our country back. And I would pose to you that there are two components or two phases of that warfare. I mean, people can look at it in different ways, but this is the way I'm going to just put it right now. Sort of two phases, but they're not chronological phases. It's not that we do one and then we move on to number two. They're simultaneous. They're occurring at the same time. And the two things I'm speaking about, the two urgent necessities for the survival of the country, are that number one, we get Donald Trump back in the White House in January of 2025. And number two, that we get the full policy of Trump's Agenda 47 as the framework for all economic policy in the second Trump administration, and not just what he has put forward already in Agenda 47, but what he might add to that in the weeks and months ahead, you know, including some of the things that have been proposed by LaRouche Pack, Promethean Action, etc. Because, look, what was one of the biggest problems with Trump's first term is that, sometimes people put it that he was surrounded by, he picked the wrong people to fill his cabinet positions and other positions, that he was surrounded by people who were no good. And that was certainly the case. At least a lot of the people were no good. Some of them were outright enemies of Trump, as we saw. But the fact is that the same effort is underway, and I'm not going to talk about the CIA or the FBI or any of the State Department, but particularly in terms of economic policy, which is what we're discussing tonight. The effort is underway to sort of preempt Trump. People coming in from the outside with their own economic agenda. And what is being proposed is anti-American. It will prevent Trump from rebuilding the country, making the country great again. It will destroy any possibility of America returning once again to being a leading industrial and technological power in the world. In fact, it will ensure that we go further downhill. And these people are now, they're all over the MAGA movement, particularly at the highest level. But you see them in many different places, trying to infiltrate with their economic agenda. Now, what I want to point to is two items that were just posted on the LaRouche PAC website. And I'm not going to talk about them in depth, but I want to point them out to people. This is the first one. This is a podcast with Susan Kokinda and Brian Lance entitled Trump's Second Term, the Heritage Foundation or the American System. And, one of the things that's referenced in there is that the Heritage Foundation has just come out with a 940-page document, almost 1,000 pages, entitled Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, in which they spew out 940 pages of nothing but British economics as what must become the agenda of the new Trump administration. And then the second one, Susan? Yeah, this is an article by Barbara Boyd. Javier Milei really ain't MAGA, quite the opposite. Now, for those who don't know him, that's his picture there with, I guess, his poor dog. Milei is the current president of Argentina, recently elected, and he is being glorified in a lot of the neoconservative circles, some of the very misguided populist circles, as sort of the Donald Trump of Argentina, the populist man of the people who's going to take on the establishment. And nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing. He is a puppet of the central bankers, the London financiers, the hedge funds, and what he is now in the process of doing is implementing an economic policy which will destroy Argentina, which is already significantly destroyed, but it will finish off Argentina. Milei, the Heritage Foundation, this is the free market economics of the British Empire. Yeah, that's good. This is associated with what's called the Austrian school of economics, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, which ain't American economics. It's British economics. In fact, there's no such thing as the Austrian school of economics. It's the British school of economics. Friedrich Hayek taught for years, his base of operations was the London School of Economics. This is all British 19th century free market imperialist economics. And, this is now, this is the economics associated with Margaret Thatcher. And there are, again, very misguided and foolish conservatives and populists who say, Margaret Thatcher was great. This is not what we need for the Trump administration. There's no way in the world we can rebuild America with those kind of policies. So that said, we'll move on here. And, this is a discussion of Benjamin Franklin. But, the key takeaway from this, which I hope if I don't make clear or does not, come across, I hope that if one thing comes across in this presentation and in this discussion, it's not the specifics of what Franklin did. Because in looking at Franklin and economics, what is immediately posed is what the hell is economics? What is economics? Tony referenced that in his brief remarks. Because it's not the way many people think about it. We've gone through now 6 decades of wrong-headed economic policies. And as we move through those decades, the mistakes have gotten worse and worse and worse. And the problem is most people today, their memory of our American economic system is all within these last 6 decades. They don't know what the American economy was like in 1946 or 1956 or under John F. Kennedy. They really have no comprehension of it. Therefore, everybody's view of economics has been shaped by what's occurred over the last 6 decades. And what do we have today? We have a central banking system which runs the world. We have offshore banking with trillions of dollars in deposits. We have shadow banking. We have wealth funds, hedge funds, mutual funds, financial securities, cryptocurrencies, and many different kinds of what are called financial derivatives. Look, banks used to have a bank, a commercial bank. Banks used to have assets that represented real physical value, right? Real physical value. Factories, companies that produce something, et cetera, et cetera. Now, they probably still have some of that, but it's a small minority of their assets. What most banks hold today are billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in what are called financial portfolios. It's all monetary assets, and it's not connected by and large to anything real. Now, one of the things about Ben Franklin, I've in the last 6 months, year, I've read a lot of Ben Franklin, and one of the things that I've come to appreciate, even though people know about Poor Richard and some of the witty things that Franklin wrote, is that I have really come to appreciate Franklin's wit and humor. And I really am of the view that he is perhaps the greatest humorist who ever lived. I mean, you'd have to go back to Aesop or something to find something comparable. It's just unbelievable, his sense of humor. And I am absolutely certain that if Franklin were alive today and he were to look at the current state of our national and global financial system, he would immediately sit down and write a satire about it. Maybe he would title it something like Poor Richard Visits the Land of the Insane, because it is insane. There's nothing rational or real about any of it. And I mean, you know, what are people get involved in today? And this may seem like a long introduction to get into Franklin, but I think it's critically important myself. How do people think about it today? You know, how are they going to maximize, you know, you know, their, their financial holdings? You know, how are they going to increase their financial wealth? I mean, look at the plethora of all the get rich quick schemes. You could do it through real estate. You could do it through cryptocurrencies. You could do it this way. You could do it that way. I mean, you got a whole generation now, and I don't want to condemn the entire generation, but certainly a significant portion of it, these millennials, who basically sort of have the idea, at least a lot of them do, of trying to figure out a way to make the maximum amount of money without even ever really holding a job, without having a career. How to game the system to simply, you know, get money out of it. Get rich quick schemes. You know, there used to be a guy, maybe there's one or two people on here who might remember him. There used to be a guy on television in New York City 40 to 50 years ago, 40 years ago at least, whose name was Reverend Ike. And he's a really sort of funny guy. He's a minister. He's black minister. And he had a little TV show basically saying that if you believe in Jesus, you can get rich, which was sort of a very strange interpretation of Christianity. But that was his whole spiel, join with me and we're all going to get rich. And I mean, this is the way people think today, and you've got to clear your minds of all of this. None of it, mutual funds, hedge funds, none of this stuff, how to buy and sell houses and make money. None of this has anything to do with economics. It's not economics at all. And you have to begin to think about economics entirely differently. So that said, we're going to start off with sort of the building blocks of economics, and we're going to start off in a way that might surprise some of you. So you want to put up the picture number 2, Tony? That's it. Now, that is a picture of what was originally called Franklin's fireplace. And then later it became popularly known as Franklin's stove. And this was something that Benjamin Franklin invented in 1743, 1744. And in 1744, he published an essay entitled An Account of the Newly Invented Pennsylvania Fireplace. All right, you could take it down now. People got the idea here. We're going to show a couple more little pictures of it in a few minutes. But you could cook on this stove. May not have looked like it in the picture, but you could cook on this stove. But the primary purpose, the primary invention involved here was that this stove drastically increased the ability to heat one's home or any other building. It was revolutionary in terms of its ability to heat dwellings. And you have to recognize the importance of this. I mean, again, this is 1744. There's no central heating. And for those who are not aware of it, the mid to late 18th century was sort of the worst period, the worst decades of what's sometimes called the Little Ice Age. It was a lot colder in Pennsylvania or New York or a lot of these places than it is today. A lot colder. For instance, you know, in 1780, this is during the Revolutionary War, so this is what Washington's army had to contend with. In 1780, the Hudson River froze over all the way down to Manhattan. And in fact, the upper part of New York Harbor froze over. And in the winter of 1780, you could walk across the Hudson River from Manhattan to Jersey City or Hoboken. You could walk across the ice. It was frozen over. Never happened since then. And people did walk across it. That's how cold it was. And heating one's home was actually a matter of life and death, literally a matter of life and death. And Franklin invented this fireplace because the fireplaces that existed at that point, and there were different kinds, there was the English fireplaces, the German fireplaces, you know, stoves and what have you, and they were all different, but there were a lot of problems with them. First of all, you got an enormous amount of smoke that came into the rooms, even if you had a good chimney. Secondly, almost all of the heat from the fire, no matter how hot the fire got, almost all of the heat went up the chimney, went up the stovepipe and then into the chimney, so that most of the heat escaped into the outdoors and never heated the room. So Franklin set up to solve this problem and set out to solve this problem. And I'm not going to go into all of his experiments. He actually, in the late 1730s, early 1740s, he did a lot of experiments, not just with designing a stove. That was the last part of his experiments. You know, he began with studying the properties of heat and the properties of air and air currents. And he conducted a lot of experiments because, you know, if you look at Franklin as an experimental scientist, you know, for him, it wasn't really, the fundamental question was never, does this work? Is what I'm, you know, this is what I'm inventing, does it work? The fundamental question for Franklin was always, why does it work? What are the physical principles that make it work? And he spent a lot of time investigating air and heat leading up to his invention of the stove, which I'm not going to go into. But, you know, he finally came up with this design where the key aspect of the design was to create a stove in which you could force the smoke and the heat to flow downward into the stove, which they don't naturally do. And they didn't in any previous stove. Why don't you put up picture 3, Tony? And it's kind of hard to see here, but I don't know if you have a pointer, Tony, but down at the bottom left of the stove here, you see this little pile? That's actually wood burning. And you can't really see it here, but anyway, what Franklin does is he forces the smoke and the heat to go up and then down and then back up through a series of what were called baffles, and then through a siphon, an upside down siphon. And he built this stove, which is a big stove, with all of these hollow baffles made out of iron, which would hold the heat. Sort of, you know, I don't know what the right term is, a condenser or something. That may be wrong. So if it's the wrong term, excuse me. But where, you know, it would hold the heat and then radiate out through the walls of the stove. And then put up the next slide number, whatever the number is, the next one. Yeah. And again, this is sort of hard to see. I'm sort of looking at it. That's why I'm turned sideways. But you could, you know, you can't really see it, but you get the sense of it, right? Of how this worked. And you see the little squiggly arrows coming off the top of the stove. That's the heat being radiated into the air. All right, you could take it down. And believe me, this stove was revolutionary, and it sold like hotcakes. Later on, a guy named Rittenhouse made a certain change to the stove, which made it even better because there was well, I'll tell you what the problem was. The problem was the stove worked perfectly, but it only worked at maximum efficiency if you had a really hot fire, a very hot fire. Otherwise, the smoke would not move through the baffles. And Rittenhouse solved that problem with a change he made. Rittenhouse, I think, was the very close friend of Franklin's, and he improved the stove. But anyway, the stove sold like hotcakes, and it had the effect that it was supposed to have. It improved the condition of life. It probably improved life expectancy. It had a direct physical effect on the lives of the people, their health, their well-being, the condition of the workforce. It improved the physical economy and the well-being of the people. And if you read Franklin's pamphlet, his account of the newly invented Pennsylvania fireplace, it really reads like a scientific treatise because he goes through exactly how this works. And then he even ends the treatise with a little poem, which I'll read to you. It's kind of funny. He says, "Another sun, 'tis true, but not the same. Alike I own in warmth and general flame, but more obliging than his elder brother. This will not scorch in summer like the other, nor when sharp boreas chills our shivering limbs, will this sun leave us for more southern climes,
No.
or in long winter nights forsake us here, to cheer new friends to other hemisphere." Well, I'm not reading it very well. "But faithful still to us, this new sun's fire warms when we please and just as we desire." So it's sort of a neat little poem to the stove he just invented. But, look, people may be expecting a discussion here, some people, of Franklin's writings on paper currency and public credit and all that. And, time permitting, I'm going to get into some of that later. But to tell you the truth, I do not think that is the most important thing here. Because if you look at Franklin's stove and take in all of the ramifications of it, in terms of the effect on the physical economy, the effect on the population, and also the fact that in producing thousands and thousands of these stoves, you needed an iron industry to do this. You needed all kinds of manufacturing and industrial, capabilities to produce these things and then get them into the marketplace, and install them in people's homes and what have you. What you're really looking at here is economics. What LaRouche called physical economics, you could call it whatever you want. The economics of, I don't know, human productivity, but this is real economics, and it's the only legitimate economics. It's the only way to look at economics. It's not like we're saying, on the one hand, we have the American system of economics, and on the other hand, you have the British free market system of economics. No, you don't, because the British system is not economics at all. It's mumbo jumbo. It's magic. That's all it is, gambling and magic. It's not economics. So we'll move on here. And in fact, just a couple little things here. In 1780, I'm sort of just gonna jump through some things which may not be directly connected to one another. But in 1782, Franklin wrote, I forget which essay it was, but it was one of his essays on economics. where he says that the entire purpose of economics and of scientific discovery, economics and scientific discovery, is, quote, to extend the power of man over matter, avert or diminish the evils he is subject to, and to augment the number of his enjoyments. And he said that all of this fell under the category of what he called useful knowledge, and that it involved, quote, all the new arts, trades, and manufactures that would increase the power of man over increase the power of man over matter. Now, this is sort of synonymous with Franklin's lifelong motto, his lifelong creed to do good in society. But when you get later on to some of the specifics, what people call the American system of economics, which involves banking, monetary policy, trade, tariffs, related credit policies, you have to understand those are predicates, or predicates is not the right word really, but those are things that you invent, a type of tariff policy, a type of credit policy. These are things that are invented to be able to carry out the fundamental purpose of economics, which, as he says, to extend the power of man over matter, to increase the productivity of your society, to increase the productivity of the individual citizen. And that, any financial institutions today which are not doing that, banks, hedge funds, wealth funds, whatever, some of these things I mentioned earlier, any of these sort of, financial so-called institutions which are not doing that, not only is that not economics, but the fact is they have no right to exist. I mean, it is my view that most of these financial institutions that exist today should not exist at all. They have no legitimate right to exist because what they are doing is contrary towards increasing the productivity of our society. So look, the fact is that at the time that Franklin lived, there was a lot of industry that was being developed in the colonies, and Franklin was in the center of some of this. I mean, the largest iron works in Pennsylvania, and the iron industry in the 1740s. The iron industry, it existed in a lot of the colonies, but the bulk of it, where it was the most extensive, was in Pennsylvania and Maryland at that time. And the largest iron mill, or whatever you want to call it, iron manufacturing facility in Pennsylvania was the Durham Iron Works. And the owner of the Durham Iron Works, the co-owner, he wasn't the sole owner, but the co-owner of the Durham Iron Works was James Logan, Franklin's patron, collaborator, friend for over 20 years. And Logan was the co-owner of the Durham Iron Works. And in fact, the Durham Iron Works was one of the iron works, it wasn't the only one, where the Franklin stove was manufactured. One historian, I can't claim if this is really true or not, but one historian that I read said that there were three significant inventions in the colonies that required iron manufacturing in the 18th century. Now, maybe there were more than three, but this guy mentions three: the Franklin stove, the Conestoga wagon, and the Pennsylvania long rifle, which is what Hawkeye uses in Last of the Mohegans, and all three of these things were manufactured in the hundreds or the thousands. I can't give you numbers. Certainly, a lot of these long rifles were manufactured, but they were all manufactured in these ironworks in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, and elsewhere, and they were building up this productive economy. So now it's not just a question of manufacturing. I said that, Franklin's work on the stove was, he wrote, it was really a scientific treatise. And, this is clearly what Franklin is, this is what he's devoted to. I don't know if I gave a class or not on Franklin's work on electricity or science, but I can tell you 2 chapters of my new book, 2 chapters are devoted to Franklin's work in electricity because it's very extensive. Franklin was a scientist, among other things. And as people may know, that in 1743, he created something called the American Philosophical Society. And he wrote another essay entitled A Proposal for Promoting Useful Knowledge Among the British Plantations in America. And this sort of became the founding document for the American Philosophical Society, in which what he calls for is for, an organization to be created devoted to useful, what he calls useful, investigations into science and, related matters. And he actually he lays out a list of areas that they should begin to investigate. And this includes, and I'll just read a little bit of it here, new discovered plants, herbs, trees, roots, and methods of propagating them, new methods of preventing disease, new methods of developing mines, minerals, and quarries, new discoveries in chemistry, new mechanical inventions for saving labor, new methods of producing mills and carriages. And then he goes on from there through geography, geology, horticulture. And he says that the purpose of these experiments is to and this is a quote, let light into the nature of things. And again, to increase the power of man over matter and multiply the conveniences of life. For Franklin, valid science, and this is really clear in his work on electricity, valid scientific discoveries reveal new principles, new discoveries, new principles, which lead to, as he says, an increased power of man over matter, power of man over nature. And then, this then flows into new technologies. And then from technologies into, new inventions for manufacturing and for all kinds of things, new locks for canals, new this, new that, the creation of a productive economy. Now, what happened in the colonies is that, and this is like, I won't use a term I used to use because it's sort of racist, but this is the short, the rapid fire, history here, folks, leaving out tons. But what happened, in the colonies is, first of all, the British oligarchs in London, the bankers in the City of London, the aristocrats in the House of Lords, the British Crown, the imperial masters of the British Empire, they never wanted the colonies to develop. economically at all. And that's not, I'm not making that up or exaggerating. Their idea of a perfect colony is what they had developed in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, right? Jamaica, Barbados. The British had this whole little empire in the West Indies, as did the French and the Dutch, and they were all the same, the way that they were run. Which was, you had an island, and on that island, you had a very small number of white people, very small, and generally no families. You had the plantation owners, you had a certain amount of administrators sent over from the Board of Trade or the British Crown, you know, sort of the governing officials. And altogether, these people made up at most 10% of the population, maybe 5%. The rest were slaves brought in from Africa, and they worked the sugar plantations. That was, and these were enormously profitable. Money poured into London from these plantations, as they did into Amsterdam and elsewhere. And that's their idea of a perfect colony. They never wanted the American colonies to develop. Their idea in America was that we should remain suppliers of raw materials, agricultural goods, you know, things like, you know, animal furs, things like that, you know. And in fact, the British during the 18th century did everything in their power to increase the number of slaves in the 13 colonies. They created the Royal Africa Company. They shipped slaves in. They set up New York City as a big slave hub. This was their idea. So they wanted to stop this from the beginning. And they did things to do that, which I'm going to skip mostly over. But what happened is that there was a big turning point in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as we know it, because the British basically bankrupted themselves in the 7 Years' War. By 1763, more than 50% of the entire British government budget went to pay interest payments on British debt, war debt. They were, you know, it was a financial catastrophe. So they hit upon a scheme where they said, well, we'll get the colonies to pay our war debt. Right? Now, people know some of this because it's the famous stuff. You know, the stamp tax, the sugar tax, the tax on tea. Yeah, there were a lot of taxes, but they did other things. One is that they passed laws. In 1751, they passed a law to outlaw iron and steel production in the colonies. Shut them down completely. They passed other laws to ban the production of all kinds of things. I mean, literally, there were scores of things that they made it illegal to manufacture. This included, like, for instance, hats. You couldn't make hats. You had to buy all your hats from London. And they did this all across the board. At the same time, they passed legislation to outlaw colonial currencies. Because, you know, for instance, there's very limited amount of money in the colonies, what they call species, you know, hard currency, very little in the colonies. So there was a history to this colonial currency. It went back to 1690, of colonies printing their own currencies, paper money. Because what happened is if you had to buy everything from London, like, for instance, nails, if you're not producing iron, you can't make nails. How do you build houses without nails? All the nails had to be imported from England. So if you had to buy everything, literally everything that's manufactured from England, then what little hard currency you have is going to be spent on importing this stuff. And that money is going to all go back to London. So the colonies found themselves in a situation where they had no circulating money, literally. So they began printing paper money. But in 1763, no, excuse me, I think it was a little bit later, 65 or 67, I don't have it right here. They passed a law in Parliament to outlaw all of the colonial currencies, outlaw them, right? Now, this is the period of, dumping tea into the Boston Harbor and all that, but it's not a tax revolt. You have to realize what's going on here. They're imposing all of these taxes, but they're also outlawing manufacturing, and they're outlawing the right of the colonies to print money. So there's no money, there's no manufacturing, and you're being taxed to death. This is a death sentence for the colonies, a death sentence, right? So this gets on to Franklin's credit system. We don't have much time left. Why don't you put up that final thing, Tony?
Sure.
Picture number 1. I'm about to tell you what you're not going to hear tonight. Labeled number 1.
Yeah.
That's it. All right. So this is, you can see it. I hope people can read it. Selected Franklin essays on economics. This is selected. He wrote a lot more than this. And he also wrote about economics in Poor Richard's Almanac. He wrote many, many letters on economics. This is a very partial list. And you can see, if you can read it, the first one is in 1729, a modest inquiry into the nature and necessity of a paper currency. And then some of the others are more well known than others. 1767, well, actually, right after the 1763, this is when they're banning paper currency in the colonies. He writes 2 papers, Remarks and Facts Relative to the American Paper Money, 1764, and then The Legal Tender of Paper Money in America, 1767. And then it goes on from there. And the last one he writes is The Internal State of America, which is on economics. And that's 1786. So 1729 to 1786, that's 57 years. So Franklin was writing continually on economics for 57 years. All right, you can take it down. Now, I'm not going to try to go through all these writings. I just can't, but again, look, as I said, the colonies began printing paper money in 1690, and they tried a lot of different schemes. They had what were called bills of credit, which were interest bearing. They were sort of like loans. And then they had, non-interest bearing paper money. They had what were called land banks, which were supposedly backed by land, equity, which, it's very was true some of the time. Sometimes they made their paper money legal tender. Sometimes they didn't. It just sort of passed on good faith. They tried a lot of different schemes in a number of the colonies. Some of them worked fairly well. Some of them didn't work at all. But what you have to understand, rather than saying, oh, this is a bad idea or that idea, is that, no one had ever done this before. These were experiments. The colonies, and Franklin really, although he disagreed with a lot of the things the various colonies did, he didn't really condemn them, because what they're trying to do is essentially come up with what you could call a public credit system, a way of generating credit through which you could finance things like manufacturing or agriculture or trade, to expand your productive economy. And they're trying various ways to do it. Now, Franklin's first intervention was again in 1729 in the nature and necessity of paper currency. And what he says there, and again, I can't go into it very much, but he comes down squarely on the question of paper currency. He says, those who are lovers of trade and delight to see manufacturers encouraged will be for having a large addition to our currency, that is the emission of paper money. For they well know that people will have little heart to advance money in trade when they can get it scarce, when they can, well, anyway, it's sort of jumbled what he says. But he says a plentiful currency will be so great a cause of advancing this province in trade, in riches, and in increasing the number of its people. So you'll notice right away, he's for printing more paper money, but he ties it directly. He says that those who delight to see manufacturers encouraged or who are lovers of trade will support this increase in paper currency. He's tying this question of public credit directly to its productive use in the economy. And he goes into a long thing about gold and silver. And he develops what he calls his labor theory of value. And he actually even calls it that, although he doesn't put quotation marks around it or anything. But he says, look, you have to distinguish between, when you're talking about gold or silver, you have to distinguish them as money, as bullion or specie, that is gold coins, silver coins, as money, from what they are as merchandise. In other words, if you mine, go out to a silver mine and you take silver out of the ground, that's not money, it's merchandise. It's an ore you're taking out, or a metal you're taking out of the ground. And there's the value of what it is as a metal. And he says these two things are not connected at all. He says gold and silver have a certain price as merchandise, but as to say that money should be based on gold and silver is a completely different thing. And he says it's erroneous. He says that really the value of your money does not derive from it being gold or silver. The value of your money derives from the productivity of your labor, the labor of society. This is what makes your currency worth something. And he actually writes about this subject in at least 2 or 3 of his essays, the ones I posted on the screen. And he spends a lot of time talking about these matters. He also goes into this well, we're sort of drawing to the close here, but look, if you look at these various things I put up on the screen, and some people might have wished that I would have talked about them more, but that's not the point I'm trying to make tonight. He goes through sort of a, I don't know if you call it an evolution, as he ages. If you look at these writings on paper money, he gets more and more precise of what he thinks should be the right approach. He eventually condemns the idea of bills of credit, interest-bearing notes, and all of this stuff. He says, the government has got to issue this money, but not through land banks. sort of, no longer has any interest in them. The government has got to issue this money. It must be legal tender. It must be secure. And he talks about the need for a revenue stream, a tax revenue stream, to ensure that what you're issuing is secured. But he also talks a lot about labor, and he talks about manufacturing, and new scientific discoveries and technology. And one of the things he writes an essay. Um, um, I forget which one it is. I think it's the positions to be examined concerning national wealth, or it might be his one entitled On the Laboring Poor, in which he says there is an argument put forward that if a nation is going to develop, and this is the argument coming out of London, by the way, this is the London School of Economics, he says there's an argument put forward that if a nation is going to develop manufacturing in order to be competitive, to be able to compete with other nations, that wages must be low. You must have low wages in order to compete as a manufacturing power. And Franklin says, that this is completely untrue. And not only is it untrue, the opposite is true. Because the development of new technologies, new science, right? The employment of a more skilled workforce living at a higher standard of living, that this makes your entire economy, your entire nation more productive, more powerful, and that the advancement of wages, of manufacturing, and science and technology all go hand in hand. And he's very explicit about this. I'm not reading into it. It's very advanced economic thinking, actually. So look, it's almost 5. So as I said, I skimmed the surface on Franklin and public credit. But the thing that I want to close with is the question of the Bank of North America. Because, earlier, in some of his earlier writings, where, Franklin discusses various ways of establishing a credit system. As I mentioned, he mentions land banks, he mentions bills of credit, he mentions all these various schemes that are being tried. And one of the things he mentions is what are called finance banks or deposit banks, banks based on financial deposits, which is what we have today. And initially, he's opposed to them, but not for perhaps the reason you might think. And he writes about this in one of the essays. I forget which one, but he writes about it. And what he says was the problem with establishing a finance bank is that, because this is before the American Revolution, is he says we're not an independent country. We're colonies. And we don't even we don't even issue our own money. The money is all controlled from London. And you have the Bank of England in London. And he says, if we were to set up a finance bank in Philadelphia or anywhere else, this bank would very, very rapidly, almost instantaneously, come under the control of the London financial markets, the Bank of England and the London financial markets. And therefore, it would come to represent the financial interests of the city of London, and not the interests of the people of Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. So basically what he says, if we set up a finance bank, it's going to be controlled by, the British financial imperialists, so we shouldn't do it. He changed his mind during the Revolutionary War. When Robert Morris created the Bank of North America. And Franklin became one of the biggest champions of the Bank of North America. I mean, there was a small group of them. I mean, there was a lot of people who supported it, but the ones who supported it vocally and strongly were Morris, Robert Morris, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Gouverneur Morris, and then a little bit later, Alexander Hamilton. Now, there were others who supported it, but these were the people who really championed the bank. And what Franklin said was, we're not in the same situation. Number one, we've declared our independence. We're sovereign. Number two, the Bank of North America is being established as a partnership, with our sovereign government. And therefore it is going to be judged and governed by how well it serves the people, that it will secure the credit of the nation, and it will act as a vehicle, for the issuance of public credit, which will build the nation up. Along the lines of what we've already discussed, manufacturing and everything else. And Franklin becomes an enthusiastic backer. And in 1784 and 87, between 1784 and 87, there was a concerted effort by a number of people to shut the bank down. This was called the Bank Wars. People may know the Bank War between Nicholas Biddle and Andrew Jackson. This was the original Bank War. It was called the Bank War at that time, 1784 to 1787, when there was a concerted effort in the Continental Congress to decertify the bank, and also in the Pennsylvania legislature to decertify the bank and shut it down. And Franklin, at one point, wrote a letter to Robert Morris, and I'm going to read you a short excerpt of it because I think it's funny. Franklin, who's now in Paris, writes a letter to Robert Morris, and he says, quote, "You are being censured by malevolent critics and bug writers who will abuse you while you are serving them and wound your character in nameless pamphlets. Thereby, they resemble those dirty little stinking insects that attack us only in the dark, disturb our repose, molesting and wounding us while our sweat and blood are contributing to their subsistence." So Franklin calls the critics of the Bank of North America dirty, stinking insects. That's a direct quote from Ben Franklin. Because what is being established here, and then what would come to fruition with Washington and Hamilton, with the first Bank of the United States, what is being established here is a national system of public credit to foster human advancement, to foster increases in productivity, prosperity, science, industry, trade, right? And that's what it was all about from the beginning. Franklin's first writing on public credit in 1729, he says, "Those who love manufacturing, will join with me, in supporting the issuance of more paper currency." Public credit for productive economic growth. That's economics. There is no other kind of economics than that. That is the only kind of economics. Forget the schools of economics, the British school, the physiocratic school, the French school, the Austrian school, the American school. It's all crap. There's only one economics, human advancement, and a public credit system to advance it. And that is what we have to make the mindset and the economic agenda of the second Trump administration.